Good afternoon. Happy February 1st and welcome to a new month of Lunch and Learn. We're thrilled those who are joining us here in our Zoom room and those who are watching on the live stream. Welcome. We are blessed to welcome to Temple Beth today, educator Harvey Leven. He holds a master's from Brandeis University in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies and a BA degree from the University of Pittsburgh in Judaic Studies. He also studied for 3 years at Israeli universities. In 2019, he became the founding director of the Melton School of Adult Jewish Learning in Jacksonville, Florida. And he served as senior director of school services for the Jewish Federation. Before that, he served as education director of Washington Hebrew Congregation in Washington, D.C. for 23 years. Synagogue that is incredible synagogue with 2 campuses like us. And we're thrilled to have Harvey live with us. One of the blessings of living in South Florida is a lot of rabbis and educators and other Jewish professionals make their way to our neck of the woods and then become part of our community, part of our congregation. And we are able to learn from them and sit side by side with them in worship. And that is the case with Harvey, that he's a regular on Friday nights here at Temple Beth and also our teacher for this month. So Harvey, welcome. I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you. We're going to, well, if I can, so I'm having trouble, Jessica, moving this over, actually moving to the next, there we go. Okay, thank you. So this is the first of 4 sessions to help us understand modern Israel today. And the first 2 are going to be looking at Israel's history, and how we got to where we are today is dependent upon what happened in the past. And I want to start by looking at the biblical promises that God made to us, to the Jewish people, about this land, the land of Israel, being ours. And you see I have on the screen several promises, one to Abraham, one to Isaac, one to Jacob, repeated, and I don't need to read them to you, but the point is that our connection to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, goes way back.
It's right over there.
I'm hearing somebody on the screen. Everybody's muted.
We'll take care of that, Harvey. Don't worry about it. We'll mute people.
Okay, thank you. So we were after being in Egypt as slaves, we of course then went to the land of Israel and we established their countries. First a country, then it became 2 countries. Why did anybody know why it is that we actually left? Why was there no longer in Israel? What happened? Anybody know? Anybody have a hand up? Jessica, can you see?
No one has a hand up.
Okay, so in the year 70, the Romans destroyed what was called the Second Temple, and there was a partial exile of our people at that time. And later on, we rebelled. And there was a great rebellion called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion that happened from the years 132 to 136 in the Common Era. And the result of that rebellion was the Romans said, you know, we've had enough of Jews rebelling, and we were exiled in mass. So the point here is that we did not leave the land of Israel willingly. We were exiled from our homeland, from our country. We're now going to take a big leap in history. Israel's founding, the next major step happened in Europe. And we're going to look into the late 1800s. And in the late 1800s in Europe, Jews were living in various situations. In some places we had equality, in other places we didn't have equality. Some places we were accepted, most places we were not accepted. France was a country in which we were ostensibly given equal rights by Napoleon. And Jews were integrated into society, but there was lots of anti-Semitism. The person on your screen is a guy named Captain Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred Dreyfus was in the upper echelons of the French military, and there were wars continuously between France and Germany taking place, and there was a spy scandal, and Dreyfus was accused of being a spy that gave important military information to the Germans. And he was like the only Jew in this level, this high level of the French military. He was convicted, and the trial unleashed horrible anti-Semitism in France. There was this big ceremony where his epaulets were removed, his sword was broken, and he was sent off to prison in Devil's Island. And this whole trial elicited huge amounts of anti-Semitism in France, with crowds shouting not only death to the traitor Dreyfus, but death to the Jews everywhere. And this was rampant throughout France. And it became clear. I'm trying to move to the next slide, Jessica, if you could help me with that. It's not.
Just press if you wiggle your arrow around in the lower left-hand screen, there'll be arrows, or you can click on or press your keyboard for the right.
Let me try enter. Nothing is happening there.
Okay, do escape.
Yeah.
And then you just click on the next slide.
There we go.
That one.
Okay. Okay. So it was clear to people in France that Dreyfus had been set up, that he really wasn't the one responsible. And a famous French writer, Émile Zola, wrote this huge article, J'accuse, I accuse, when he accused the government and the army of France for framing Dreyfus. And Dreyfus indeed was innocent. Reporting on this whole affair was this guy. Okay, this guy is Theodore Herzl. He was a reporter covering this from Vienna, Austria. He was Jewish. He was very assimilated, but he was struck by how in France, in modern France, where Jews supposedly had full equality, that how is it that the crowds were shouting death to the Jews? It was very unsettling. And as a result, he became the founder of modern Zionism. And he wrote a book. And let's see if I can get to here. He wrote a book that was called The Jewish State. And in this book, he describes how a Jewish country could be formed, and that it would take maybe 50 years for that to happen. And he spent a lot of his life trying to make it happen. He organized the first Zionist Congress, and here's a picture of that. And at the Zionist Congress, there were two major things that happened. Foundation of the Zionist organization. And by the way, the word Zionist comes from the word Zion. Mount Zion is one of the mountains surrounding Jerusalem. And also the adaptation of Hatikvah as the Zionist organization's national anthem. So these were some of the major accomplishments of the first Congress. But later, he wrote in his diary this: were I to sum up the Basel Congress in a word, which I shall guard against pronouncing publicly, it would be this. At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it. This was written in 1887. Okay, so 50 years later, he didn't quite make it, but 60 years later, he did make it. Okay, so he's considered the father of modern Zionism. And the point that he would make was that Jews, contrary to how most Jews see ourselves in America, are not a religious group, but instead, we're a national group, exiled by the Romans. When we say the words, the Jewish people with a capital P, okay, that really means the Jewish nation. And some people ask, how can you be, a nation? That usually means a country, but a country is separate from a nation. The nation is the people. And so Israel is based on the concept that we as a people, as a national group, have a right to return to the homeland from which we were exiled. So that's what Israel is all about. It is not a religious state. Okay, let's go on here. Here. So the Jewish population in the land of Israel grew dramatically. Between 1890, 1915, it really doubled. And the reasons for that were, one, in Russia, there was great persecution against the Jews. The Russian Tsar had a 3-point program for the Jews. One was that 1/3 were to be killed. If you remember Fiddler on the Roof and the pogroms. Second part was 1/3 would convert, and the other 1/3 were supposed to migrate. Well, conditions were very harsh. Jews were drafted into the Russian army for 25 years, which was basically a life sentence, and that caused many Jews to leave. Also, the Zionist ideology was becoming widespread, and by 1936, you can see that the population, had really mushroomed, had really changed a lot. Okay. World War I happens, 1914. The land of Israel is being controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was basically Turkey, and they had run the land of Israel for over 400 years. And Britain was fighting on the other side. They were fighting against the Ottoman Empire. And during this war, during World War I, Lord Rothschild, who was the Foreign Secretary of England, issued something known as the Arthur Balfour was the foreign secretary. He issued what became known as the Balfour Declaration. And this was very significant. I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So, what is it that this declaration actually promised? Did it promise a Jewish country, a Jewish state, a political state? It did not. It promised a national home. Okay, so it could be that the British had in mind a protectorate where Jews would be, that the British would be in charge of. It also wanted to make sure that this meant that Jews living elsewhere would not be thrown out. Okay, so that's protecting Jewish rights elsewhere. And it also made reference here to the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities in Palestine not being negatively affected. Notice it did not talk about community rights, but only civil and religious rights. So when this was issued, the Jewish community rejoiced because we had, for the first time in hundreds of years, we had the country that was in charge of the land of Israel saying, Jews, you can come back, and we support it. And it was a very, very major event. I would mention here that not only was there no Israel at the time that this was issued, there was no Palestine, no Palestinian state, there was no Jordanian state, there was no Syrian state, no Lebanon. Everything was part of the Ottoman Empire. So after World War I, the world established the League of Nations, and that was established in 1922. And very importantly, this declaration was part of the League's mandate that it gave to Britain. So the League of Nations told Britain that it could control the land of Israel under a mandate, and this declaration was part of it. So it was obligated, the world community obligated Britain to facilitate a Jewish homeland, or a Jewish home, a national home in the land of Israel. I want to now refer to this. There are those who say that we, the Jewish people, took this land, that we took it from others. And I have here, I'm going to read it to you. This is dated September 20th, 1926. And it's a letter from the Jewish National Fund in New York to my grandfather. Okay. And basically it's a receipt. Okay. It's a receipt for $100 that he donated to purchase land through the Jewish National Fund for the Jewish people. And noted here the realization that for your contribution, 5 dunams of land will be redeemed in Palestine. So what does this mean? 5 dunams was about 1.25 acres. It meant that my grandfather in 1926, when Israel was a swamp, sent $100, which was a lot of money. Okay, my grandfather was not a wealthy man. In fact, my dad had to share a bicycle with his brother. They had one bicycle, right? They didn't have a lot of money, but this was important. And if my family kept this letter, that means that your families had letters like this too, that Jews all over the world contributed money to buy land in the land of Israel. Okay? So that's a very significant thing. I don't know why it is that my family kept this, but they did. So let's move forward. Jews are settling more and more now in the land of Israel. We saw in the previous slide that by 1936, there were 450,000. And about that time, there was in Palestine pushback from the local Arab community, and there were riots against the Jewish community. And there was something called the Arab Revolt that took place for over a year in Palestine. And it was so dire that the British government sent a fact-finding commission to the land of Israel to find out what was going on here. And this was called the Peel Commission. And this is one of the paragraphs of their report. An irrepressible conflict has arisen between 2 national communities within the narrow bounds of one small country. There is no common ground between them. Their national aspirations are incompatible. The Arabs' desire to revive the traditions of the Arab Golden Age. The Jews' desire to show what they can achieve when restored to the land in which the Jewish nation was born. Neither of the two national ideals permits of combination in the service of a single state. So in 1937, the Peel Commission was recommending what today is called a two-state solution, that there be a territory for the Jews and a territory for the Palestinian Arabs to be created. Okay, so this was a long time ago. This was recommended. We're going to move a little bit forward now. And what's going on in the world in 1939? What starts in September 1939? World War II starts. Germany invades Poland, and the war begins. And also, of course, at that time, the Holocaust is very much taking shape. How does the war affect what's going on with the Jews in the land of Israel? Well, in May of 39, shortly before the war breaks out, because of Arab violence and British desire to have oil, they issued what was known as the White Paper, which, if you read this, you'll see it limited immigration from Europe to the land of Israel to a maximum of 75,000 over 5 years. Okay. Well, right when the Jewish people needed a refuge, needed a place to go, Britain cut off our access to the land of Israel, basically, with these 75,000 exceptions. And you know the results of that. In some cases, well, let me tell you before the cases that the Jewish community in Palestine, and it was called, by the way, the Yishuv, Y-I-S-H-U-V, it means settlement. They developed a policy of their own to respond to this. They said basically that, you know what, we have to support Britain and the Allies in the fight against the Nazis because, well, it's just clear. You know, and there was a chance, by the way, that the German African Corps would have made its way into Palestine if they defeated the British, would have slaughtered, of course, all the Jews there. So the Yishuv had to say, we have to support the British Army in this case. But they also said, we have to fight the British in terms of immigration. So the statement that came out by David Ben-Gurion, who was the head of the Yishuv, said, we will fight the war as if there is no white paper. And we will fight the white paper as if there is no war. So how is it that the white paper was fought? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Jessica, do you see anybody with hands up?
No.
Okay, so the white paper was fought through illegal immigration. And that happened through ships. And you probably are familiar with the movie Exodus, right? Where Jews came and broke through British blockade, bringing in immigrants. So that was taking place on the one hand. And on the other hand, there was a brigade in the British Army called the Jewish Brigade that was made up of members of the Haganah. The Haganah was the Jewish Defense Forces in the land of Israel. And in fact, this brigade, the Jewish Brigade, fought in one of the last major battles of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, when the Germans were attempting to break out of the stranglehold that the Allies had on them. And there are pictures of the Haganah painting Jewish stars on the artillery shells that were going to be sent against the Germans, because it felt good to be fighting back against the Germans as Jews. So we had all of this taking place. So the war ends, and once the war ends, the Jewish community now is pushing for much more autonomy, wanting more immigration, looking to the time that there is going to be actually a Jewish country, a Jewish state. And so there were different groups of Jewish fighters that were formed. The Haganah, we already talked about, being the defense forces. There were other forces as well, one called the Irgun and one called Lehi. And these organizations adopted much more aggressive, some would say even terrorist tactics to force the British out of Palestine. And ultimately, this was happening. I'm going to move forward here. What did we have right here? Okay. The British became fed up with trying to administer territory that didn't seem to want them. The Jews were fighting them. The Arabs were fighting the Jews. It was not a pleasant time. So a proposition was taken to the United Nations. And the proposition basically was what the Peel Committee had recommended in 1937, that the land be divided into Jewish and Arab countries. On this map, the darker areas are what was going to be the Arab countries, the Palestinian country, and the checkered area here was what was going to be the Jewish country. Now, the Jews were not at all happy with this, okay? Not at all happy. Why wouldn't we be happy? Because this isn't much of a territory for a country. Okay, we get desert. The Negev was all desert. We have what's called the coastal plain, okay, but not much else. The Arabs were not happy either. Why were they not happy? They didn't want the Jews to have any of this area. Nothing at all. Well, both groups had to decide how they were going to react to the partition plan. And in prior to the plan's proposal, the Jewish community, the Yeshuv, under Ben-Gurion, decided, you know what? After the Holocaust, having half a loaf, having a place for us to be, is more important than having a full loaf. So the Jewish community accepted the partition plan. The Arab community said, we don't want the Jews to have any of the loaf at all, and they rejected it. However, it was approved, the partition plan was approved by the United Nations, and here is where, Jake, if you could run that first piece of the video for us.
Jake, do you need him to stop sharing or you can do it?
I can do it. I'm just bringing it up 1 second.
Okay, thanks.
I'm sorry, folks, just 1 second.
Jake, I could bring it up on my screen if it's becoming a problem.
Yeah, Harvey, why don't you give it a shot?
Okay, let's see what I can do here. Okay.
Just remember to share sound, Harvey,
Thank you. Where do I do that?
in the lower left. Okay, you have to unshare, stop
We're
share.
good, folks. I got it up right here.
Okay,
you got
Harvey,
it.
stop sharing. Jake will do it.
Okay, let me exit that and
Just make sure we have, Jake, make sure we have sound, please. I don't think there's sound yet. Someone's got to stop sharing and reshare, pressing sound. Thanks.
Let's see here. I'm not getting an off.
And long for a homeland free from persecution.
Now we don't have video.
No. Soviet Union.
We do have video. You're just not,
Not seeing it.
well, we
Okay.
did. We
All
did
right.
have video. Harvey, you just may not be seeing it. Sorry,
Okay.
everyone.
That's
I
fine.
apologize.
And long for a homeland free from persecution.
Egypt. No. Soviet Union. Yes. United Kingdom. Abstain. The United States. Yes.
Resolution of the Dutch Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstained.
The Partition Plan gave the Jews of Palestine a small state within the land of Israel. Areas of predominantly Arab population were to become part of the Arab state, including most of the Galilee. Predominantly Jewish areas would remain Jewish. The Negev was given to the Jews. Jerusalem at the map center was to be internationalized.
Hey, cut it off, please, Jake, at that point. Thank you. Okay, am I sharing my screen again here?
No, you need to press the share screen button.
Okay. And I want this one. Okay.
Now you're
Everybody's-
good.
Okay, thank you. So what you just saw was the United Nations vote on the Partition Plan, which was approved. So right after that vote, the following things happened. This is from the New York Times. Okay. Israel was proclaimed. President Truman recognizes it. Okay. Tel Aviv is bombed. Egypt orders invasion. Okay. So what is going on then? Because the Arab states had all rejected the idea of a partition and that the Jews could have any land at all, there was a massive invasion. The Jews had 650,000 people in this area. Think how many Jews there are in the South Florida area. I have no idea how many, but I bet you it's at least as many as 650,000. And Syria invaded. The Transjordanian army invaded. The Transjordan was trained and led by British officers. Egypt invaded. Lebanese invaded, and the Iraqis invaded. Okay, all against this small group of Jews, basically. Not only that, but within the country itself, the Arab population was also attacking Jewish settlements. Okay, so this was a very difficult time, and it was, even Ben-Gurion thought it was 50-50 whether Israel would survive this onslaught or not. And turned out that Israel did. You saw that the United States recognized Israel's existence. The second country, very shortly after, to recognize Israel was the Soviet Union, which may surprise people. because a lot of the time since then, the Soviet Union had been an enemy of Israel, supporting the Arabs. But at this time, what the Soviet Union thought and understood was that the Jews who had founded Israel, who had founded this country, were mostly from Russia, and they founded kibbutzim on socialist principles. The Soviets thought that maybe they had an ally, people who had the same ideology. There was an 11-month war between Israel, the local Palestinian population, and all of these Arab countries. And meanwhile, Israel began receiving weapons shipments, some from Czechoslovakia, because the Russians approved of it. Others came from the United States, even though there was a theoretical arms embargo. And in the 11-month war, a full 1% of Israel's population died, was killed. And when that war ended, this is what the new boundaries, on this side is the new boundaries of what Israel looked like. So what happened here? First, because the Arab states and the local Palestinian population didn't accept the partition and fighting, that meant that the boundaries of the partition plan were no longer valid. And so Israel, by rights, and based on the ceasefire, was able to increase the territory that it held. Secondly, this area, you see, that was going to be for the Palestinians. You see this area here, okay? This area was taken over by Jordan, Transjordan, and occupied by Transjordan. They didn't say, we're going to give this area to the Palestinians. They said, it's now part of Jordan. This area here in the red is what's known today as the Gaza Strip. Okay, this was taken over by Egypt. And at the end of 1949, this is what the map of Israel looked like. And this is called the June 5th boundaries. We'll talk about that either later today or maybe next time. When this war ended, it was very significant how it ended. Most wars end when there's a peace treaty between the two parties fighting. However, in this case, the war ended in a ceasefire on all fronts. Okay, so there was no peace treaty. The Jordanians didn't make peace with Israel. Egypt didn't. None of these countries did. Why? Because once you make peace with a country, you recognize that it exists, that it is there legitimately. And none of these Arab countries were prepared to do that in 1949. So they had ceasefire lines that were in existence. Very significant. Israel wanted to have peace treaties. None of the other Arab countries wanted to do that. And that's how things remained until a few years later. Now, I'm going to stop to share the screen because I don't have any more slides to show you, but I'm going to talk with you about what happened next. So I'm going to stop this share. Okay, so 1949, Israel is there. Israel is existing. However, there is lots of terror that's happening. There are terrorists infiltrating from the Gaza Strip, from what we now know as the West Bank. Okay, and there was not real peace in Israel. On the other hand, Israel has absorbed between 1949 and 1956, 680,000 new immigrants. Remember, the population when Israel was founded was 650,000. So now we're looking at a population of an influx of 680,000 more people. Many of these were refugees from the Holocaust, and many more were new immigrants who came from Arab lands. Why were there so many coming from Arab lands? Well, after Israel won the War of Independence, there were pogroms, riots in many Arab countries, and the Jewish population was forced out. And where did many of them go? Many of them came to Israel, others went other places. But Israel has to deal with doubling its population. And there were great economic hardships. There were a lack of food. People were housed in tents. And that's where a lot of American Jewry philanthropy toward Israel began, because there was a need to help Israel absorb all these people. Plus, in the 1950s, American Jews were keenly aware of what had happened in the Holocaust, and there was a feeling that we didn't do, as American Jews, we didn't do enough to save our people there. So there was a feeling of guilt. There was also, and this is something significant really to this very day, we wanted, as American Jews, we wanted to know that there was a place for us to go if we needed to have one. We were very secure in America, but as we just saw in Europe, you never know. And one of Israel's first laws that it enacted was the law of return. And the law of return said that any Jew could return to Israel and basically have immediate citizenship. You couldn't be denied coming to Israel. Why was it called the law of return and not the law of immigration? Because in Israel's view, our people had been exiled. We didn't just, take a trip. We were exiled against our will. And so we were returning to what was rightfully ours. And we felt as American Jews, and still feel, that it's good to have a place to go if necessary. In addition to the Jews who came that were done openly, Israel started an operation called Operation Magic Carpet. Some of you may have heard of that before. Operation Magic Carpet. 50,000 Jews from Yemen, were brought clandestinely to Israel. 50,000. The Yemenite community was very large, very knowledgeable, and people today still trace roots to the Yemenite Jewish community. But the security situation in Israel was remaining tenuous because of terrorist infiltration. Also taking place at that time was a nationalistic fervor in Egypt. And Egypt's president was named Gamal Abdel Nasser. And Nasser decided in 1956 to nationalize the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is on the just west of the Sinai Peninsula, and Nasser had decided to nationalize it. It had been built by the British and the French and was used worldwide for people to, for shipping purposes. Well, this infuriated the British and the French, and they worked out an alliance with Israel. Israel was angry at the Egyptians because of infiltration from Gaza and terrorists that they were supporting, and because Israel didn't have access to its southern port of Eilat, and Egypt was not allowing shipping to go to Eilat, because Egypt was still at war with Israel following the War of Independence. Remember, there were ceasefires. So in 56, the British and the French parachuted into the Suez Canal area, took over control of the Suez Canal, while simultaneously Israeli forces invaded the Sinai captured the whole Sinai Peninsula, and along with Britain and France, they dealt with this issue of the canal being nationalized, or so they thought. And they dealt with the issue of terrorists coming from Gaza, and they dealt with the issue of access to the port of Eilat, so they thought. But there was an expression that goes like this: when the United States sneezes, Israel catches cold. So what happened? The United States sneezed. The United States, under President Eisenhower, was not part of this arrangement with Britain and France to retake the canal. And the United States was angry. And the United States said, get out of there. And so, with some negotiation, Britain and France withdrew, and Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai in 56. This was called, by the way, the 1956 Sinai Campaign. We don't hear a lot about it. But as conditions for withdrawing, two very important things happened. One, the United Nations Egypt agreed to have the United Nations station peacekeepers along the border between Egypt and Israel to prevent terrorists from crossing into Israel. And Egypt agreed at that time to allow shipping to go to Eilat. So Israel withdrew, but basically achieved its goals from this war. We're going to move a little bit forward. I want to save most of what we're going to talk about now till next week. So we'll have a few minutes for questions if people have or comments. But the map of Israel stayed, as I showed you before, after 49. And there seemed to be quiet from 1956 up till 1967. Yeah, there were border skirmishes. There were times when Syrian planes were shot down by Israel, but basically there was quiet until in May of 1967, President Nasser of Egypt received intelligence information from the Russians, which was incorrect, saying that Israel was massing forces along the Syrian border and along its border with Egypt in the Sinai. This was inaccurate information. And Egypt felt that was a provocation and said, you know what, we're going to end once and for all this whole business of there being an Israel. And they were preparing to wipe Israel off the map. And they formed an alliance with Syria in the north of Israel, and later with Jordan in the east of Israel, and we're preparing to launch an assault. Let me stop there and see if we have questions or comments at this time before I go into what happened next.
Are there any questions or comments? Okay, you're good, Harvey.
Okay.
And we just have a couple minutes, so.
Okay. So Jake, I'll run the next one. We're ready for the next video. I'll be able to run that. Okay.
Just make sure you share sound.
Right, you'll have to show me again where to do that, but okay, when it's time.
When you press your share screen button on the lower left hand corner, there's a box to check that says share sound. Check that box. If you can't do it, Jake will do it.
Okay. I'm not quite ready there yet, but very, very close. So what happens now in May of 67? Couple of things. First, there's this alliance with Egypt and Syria and Jordan. Egypt stations hundreds of tanks on Israel's Sinai border. Syria does the same. Then Egypt announces once again it is closing the Straits of Tiran, which lead into the port of Eilat. So they're saying that what Israel gained in the 56 Sinai campaign is now being eliminated because you can't go there. That port is blocked to any shipping going to Israel, whether it's Israeli or whether it's international. And then, to make matters worse, Nasser said, UN peacekeepers who are on the border between Egypt and Israel, go home. You're no longer welcome. Now, one would think that the United Nations, which is there to prevent a war, would say, well, no, we're here exactly, for this purpose, to prevent war. However, the United Nations did exactly what Nasser asked. It packed up and left. So now there's no international peacekeepers between Egypt and Israel. Egypt moves tanks to the border. Okay, Israel mobilizes. Okay, when Israel mobilizes, at that point there were 2.5 million citizens in Israel. That means that everybody from every job that they are working at stops and goes to their reserve units. Okay, so the country economically comes to a standstill. In many instances, Jews from around the world then flew to Israel to help maintain the economy by taking over some of these jobs, but still basically the economy was at a standstill. Also at that time, Israel, with the help of the United States, was organizing a flotilla, an international flotilla, to challenge the blockade to go through the Straits of Tiran to head to Eilat. Okay, and that was going to happen to see if Egypt would really fire on them or not. But things got way out of hand, and Israel actually, what happened, there were some Egyptian soldiers who crossed the border inadvertently from the Gaza Strip, who were captured and interrogated, and Israel learned of the impending Egyptian invasion. And Israel then launched a preemptive attack. Now, before we go on, I'm going to see if I can share. Do I have to unshare first, Jessica?
Yeah, I think Jake has it. Jake, is that your screen? Or is that your, who?
I didn't do anything, so maybe that's Jake.
We are all set with the video.
Okay, so let's.
We're going to have Jake play it.
Okay, go ahead. There's a little
I'm Mike Wallace. For years, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser had assumed the mantle of leader of the Arab world by promising the destruction of Israel and the liberation of land he said rightfully belonged to the Arabs. But for years, he had failed to back up his words with deeds. Now, in 1967, Nasser, heavily armed by the Soviet Union, seemed ready to make good on his threat. He promised to close the Strait of Tiran, Israel's vital waterway to and from Africa and Asia.
This is where the war began, at Ras Nasrani, 20 miles north of Sharm el-Sheikh, overlooking the Strait of Tiran at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. Not a shot was fired. Instead, on May the 22nd, Gamal Abdel Nasser declared that Israeli ships and foreign shipping bound for Israel could no longer use the strait. It was Egyptian territorial waters, he said. And because Egypt and Israel had been in a state of war, he declared, since 1948, it was Egypt's right of belligerency to deny passage to ships bound for the Israeli port of Eilat, 115 miles up the Aqaba Gulf. To Israel, the blockade was an act of war, an attempt at economic strangulation.
Is there anyone question the fact that this is an act of aggression, an act of war against Israel? Much bigger and much more important than any first shot fired.
To back up his threats, Nasser placed 100,000 troops and 1,000 tanks on Egypt's border with Israel. The rest of the Arab world joined in, caught in a sudden frenzy of preparation for a holy war.
Any nations support for Israel. Any nation that decides to fight Israel's battles against our rights is against us and will become our enemy.
Almost overnight, Israel found itself surrounded by Arabs bent on destroying Israel. 250,000 troops, 2,000 tanks, and 700 planes ready for battle.
Thousands of Egyptians have gathered to show their support for President Nasser. The crowd has been chanting, "I want to go to Israel. I want to go to Israel." This meeting was extremely warlike, and preparations in Cairo generally are on a similar level.
The pressure on Israel grew. Nasser requested the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers from the Gaza Strip. Peacekeepers who had been in place since the last Arab-Israeli war in 1956. And the UN forces folded their tents. They left.
According to the Israeli radio, they're saying in the world outside that war in the Middle East could come in a matter of hours. For all these Israeli troops know, that may be right. They've been ready for 2 weeks now, all wound up and waiting. This particular unit is waiting in a kibbutz on the Egyptian border. Like the kibbutz itself, part of Israel's border defenses. The troops waiting and working here only have to look around them to see what they're fighting for.
Okay, Jay, can turn that off.
Harvey, I'm just conscious of time. That was an excellent video. I've never seen that. That's really fabulous. We just have a minute or two. So did you want to say some closing words?
Yeah, I did. I just want to say that what we're going to look at next week will be the results of the 6-day war. And that's very significant because that sets the stage for issues that Israel has to this very day with Palestinians. I just also wanted to reinforce what we looked at today, that Israel had wanted peace with its neighbors, but the neighbors weren't prepared at this time to have peace with her, and that happens much later, as we'll see next week.
Fabulous. All right. Thank you so much, Jake. Thank you for being our awesome producer. We worked too hard today. Harvey, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And we'll see everybody next week. Thank you.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.